Senator Rennick.
Thank you, Acting Madam Deputy President. If the carnage and human tragedy of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars have taught us anything, it's that everyday people are made to suffer at the hands of elites who lack the empathy to understand the true horror of war. Rather than learn from the failure of the Middle East occupations, it seems we are doomed to repeat them. The origins of the Ukraine war didn't start this year, but in late 2013, with the then Ukrainian President Yanukovych's decision to suspend an association agreement with the EU. As stated by Yanukovych, parts of the EU deal were inadequate and Ukraine did not have the money to upgrade to European standards. To quote an MP from the Party of Regions, the governing party, "If we had signed, we would have opened our borders and killed our own manufacturers." The decision to delay this decision led to riots and the eventual overthrow of the democratically elected president in the early months of 2014. The Party of Regions represented Ukrainians from eastern Ukraine, where significant manufacturing took place. It was quite within the governing party's right to act in the best interests of their constituents. This, however, wasn't enough for the anti-government protesters, who spent the next 4 months protesting outside the Ukrainian parliament. The protests turned violent and many members of the governing party fled the capital and even the country. Liberal democracies should change via the ballot box and not by a small minority of protesters. What was particularly concerning about the overthrow was that it was supported by the then US administration under Barack Obama. Indeed, a leaked phone call between Victor Yanukovych, Assistant Secretary of State, and the US Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, revealed US officials discussing who should move into the new administration. John Kerry also held meetings with the soon-to-be installed president in the month prior to the overthrow. After the overthrow, Yanukovych is filmed at a dinner sponsored by Chevron, boasting about spending $5 billion to promote democracy. Misinformation if ever I heard it. Rather than promote democracy, she was aiding in overthrowing it. How can the West pretend to support democracy when it engages in activities like this? And how can the West pretend to uphold good government when just months after installing a new regime, Hunter Biden, the son of the then Vice President, now President, was employed by a Ukrainian oil company, even though he couldn't speak Ukrainian or had ever worked in the oil industry? The first action of the incoming regime was to overthrow the law that allowed the use of Russian, Hungarian, Romanian and Moldovan language in court, schools and other government institutions in cities and provinces where minorities exceeded 10%. So much for free speech and diversity. However, these actions were just the start of what was to become a brutal civil war between pro-Russian forces in the east and pro-nationalist in the western Ukraine. It is estimated that over 14,000 people have died in the 8-year war. The BBC has reported that Russian-speaking Ukrainians were even beheaded. Most of the casualties have been incurred by the Russian-speaking Ukrainians. Is it any wonder many of the Russian-speaking minority in eastern Ukraine want autonomy when their own party was overthrown with the help of the US government and then persecuted by the installed regime? An often overlooked aspect of the question as to whether or not Ukraine should join the EU is the fact that no one has asked Europeans whether or not they want Ukraine to be a part of Europe. The one exception to this was a Dutch referendum on an association agreement with Ukraine, held in late 2016, whereby they voted against Ukraine joining the EU 62% to 38%. Before the elites try and move any more pieces on the chessboard of Europe, the technocrats and politicians should ask the Europeans what they want via a referendum, rather than orchestrating a violent coup. To do otherwise is to override democracy. This conflict is not aimed at upholding freedom or democracy. It's about protecting the interests of the elites. Multinationals will get access to Ukrainian markets, while the EU taxpayer picks up the tab for developing Ukraine. At the same time, Western oil companies cut Russian energy supplies out of the European market. These measures will push Russia and its resources into China's orbit.